The cabin door splintered beneath Nathan Allen's boot as he burst through, his weathered face twisted with rage. Barbara Perez pressed herself against the far wall, her swollen belly straining against her worn dress, her hands instinctively protecting the child within. The winter wind howled through the broken door frame, carrying with it the scent of snow and something far more sinister, the metallic tang of violence that had followed Nathan across 3 territories. "You're carrying his bastard," Nathan snarled, his eyes wild with the kind of fury that had driven away 7 pregnant women before Barbara. The others had fled within days, terrified by his unpredictable moods and the whispered stories that followed him like shadows. But Barbara had nowhere to run. Her husband had died in the mine 6 months ago, leaving her with nothing but debts and the growing life inside her that wasn't his. Barbara's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Nathan's calloused hands clench and unclench at his sides. She had seen those hands gentle a spooked horse, split firewood with mechanical precision, and just yesterday she had watched them tremble as he placed a bowl of stew before her without meeting her eyes. The contradiction of this man had puzzled her for weeks, but now, seeing him in the grip of whatever demons drove him, she understood why the others had run. "I never said it was anyone else's," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing the tension that filled the small cabin like smoke. Nathan's gaze dropped to her belly, and for a moment something flickered across his features that might have been pain. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting dancing shadows on the log walls that had become her prison and sanctuary over the past month. Barbara had come to Nathan's remote homestead out of desperation, answering his advertisement for a housekeeper with the kind of careful hope that desperation breeds. She had expected to work for her keep until the baby came, then move on to whatever life awaited a widow with a child. She had not expected the complexity of Nathan Allen. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Now let's go back to where this all began, to understand how a woman everyone called the Fat Widow came to be the only one who could tame the man they whispered about in town. 3 months earlier, Barbara had stood in the general store in Millbrook, her last $5 clutched in her gloved hand, reading the notice board with the kind of desperation that makes every opportunity seem like providence. The paper was yellowed and had clearly been posted for some time. Housekeeper wanted for remote homestead. Room and board provided. Must be willing to cook, clean, and manage household duties. Pregnant women welcome. Inquire with store owner for directions. The last line had caught her attention like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. In a territory where pregnant women without husbands were often treated as pariahs, the phrase "pregnant women welcome" seemed almost too good to be true. Barbara had approached the store owner, a thin man named Benjamin White, whose nervous demeanor suggested he knew more about Nathan Allen than he was willing to share. Mr. White had given her the directions with obvious reluctance, his eyes avoiding hers as he spoke. "The homestead's about 15 miles north," he had said, his voice low as if he feared being overheard. "Follow the creek until you reach the split oak, then head west up the ridge. But miss," he had added, catching her arm gently as she turned to leave, "you might want to reconsider. Nathan Allen isn't like other men." Barbara had pressed him for details, but Benjamin White had simply shaken his head and returned to arranging canned goods on his shelves with unnecessary vigor. She had left the store with directions and a growing sense of unease, but also with determination born of having no other choice. The boarding house where she had been staying had made it clear that her welcome was wearing thin, and the few jobs available to women in Millbrook required references she didn't possess and a reputation she couldn't claim. The journey to Nathan's homestead had taken her the better part of a day, riding in the back of a supply wagon driven by Mark Nelson, a grizzled prospector who had agreed to take her as far as the Split Oak for $2. Mark had been talkative for the first half of the journey, regaling her with stories of successful claims and failed ventures. But as they drew closer to their destination, he had grown increasingly quiet. "You sure about this, Mrs.?" Mark had asked as they reached the Split Oak, its massive trunk scarred by lightning and time. "Nathan Allen's got a reputation for being hard on women, especially ones in your condition. 7 of them have come and gone in the past 2 years, and none stayed longer than 3 days. Barbara had climbed down from the wagon with her single carpet bag, her back aching from the journey, and her resolve strengthening with each word of discouragement. She had thanked Mark for his concern and his transportation, then watched him drive away with what seemed like unseemly haste, leaving her alone at the base of the ridge with only the sound of the wind through the trees for company. The climb up the ridge had been more challenging than she had anticipated, her pregnancy making her clumsy and easily winded. The path, such as it was, seemed to have been carved by necessity rather than design, winding between boulders and fallen logs, with no consideration for comfort or ease of travel. As she climbed higher, the trees grew thicker and the silence more profound, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of some unseen creature in the underbrush. When she finally crested the ridge and saw Nathan's homestead spread before her, Barbara had to admit it was not what she had expected. The main cabin was larger than most, built from logs that had been carefully fitted and chinked against the weather. A smaller outbuilding served as a barn, and she could see a well-tended garden plot behind the cabin, though it lay dormant now in the grip of early winter. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line, and the whole scene had an air of competent self-sufficiency that spoke well of its owner. Nathan Allen had emerged from the barn as she approached, and Barbara's first sight of him had been reassuring in its ordinariness. He was a man of medium height and solid build, his dark hair touched with gray at the temples and his face weathered by years of outdoor work. His clothes were clean but well worn, and he moved with the economical grace of a man accustomed to physical labor. It was only when he drew closer and she saw his eyes that she began to understand what Benjamin White and Mark Nelson had been trying to warn her about. Nathan's eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and distant, and they held a wariness that went beyond mere caution. When he looked at her, Barbara felt as though he was cataloging every detail, searching for some sign of weakness or deception that would justify sending her away before she could disappoint him as the others apparently had. His gaze lingered on her swollen belly with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that might have been or anger or a combination of both. "You're here about the position," he had said, and it wasn't really a question. His voice was deep and carefully controlled, each word measured as if he had learned to be cautious about everything he revealed. Barbara had nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look after her long journey, her dress wrinkled and her hair escaping from its pins. "I am," she had replied, straightening her shoulders and meeting his gaze directly. "I'm Barbara Perez. I'm a hard worker, and I need the position." Nathan had studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes moving from her face to her belly and back again. Something in his expression had shifted almost imperceptibly, and Barbara had the strange feeling that she had passed some sort of test she hadn't known she was taking. "The others didn't last," he had said bluntly. "Most of them were gone before the first night was over. The rest didn't make it through 3 days. You might want to reconsider." Barbara had lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of dignity she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm not the others," she had replied simply. "I'm here because I need to be, not because I want to be. That makes a difference." Nathan had considered this for another long moment, then nodded toward the cabin. "We'll try it for a week," he had said. "If you can manage that long, we'll talk about making it permanent. The work's hard, and I don't tolerate laziness or complaining. You'll have your own room, 3 meals a day, and $1 a week besides." Fair enough. Barbara had agreed, though she wondered what she was agreeing to as she followed Nathan into the cabin. The interior had surprised her with its cleanliness and order. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a well-built table and chairs occupying the center of the space. Shelves lined the walls, holding an impressive collection of books alongside the usual household necessities, and Barbara had noted with approval that everything had its place and seemed to be in it. Nathan had shown her to a small room off the main area, furnished with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a washstand. The room was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean, and the bed had been made up with fresh linens that smelled of lavender and sunshine. A small window looked out over the garden plot and the forest beyond, and Barbara had felt a sense of relief that surprised her with its intensity. "The rules are simple," Nathan had said from the doorway, his tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "Breakfast at 6, dinner at noon, supper at 6. I'm usually out working during the day, but I expect the cabin to be kept clean and the meals to be ready on time. I don't drink, and I don't allow drinking on the property. I don't entertain visitors, And I'd prefer if you didn't either. Any questions? Barbara had shaken her head, though a dozen questions had crowded her mind. Nathan had nodded once and withdrawn, leaving her alone to unpack her few belongings and contemplate what she had gotten herself into. Through the thin walls, she had heard him moving about the main room, the scrape of a chair being pulled out, the rustle of pages being turned. When she had emerged an hour later, she had found him seated at the table with an open book, his pale eyes focused on the printed page with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. That first evening had set the pattern for the days that followed. Nathan was a man of rigid routine and few words, rising before dawn to tend to the animals and work on the various projects that seemed to occupy his days. Barbara had quickly learned that he expected his meals to be substantial and on time. But beyond that, he seemed content to leave her to manage the household as she saw fit. He spoke only when necessary, and then in the careful, measured tones of a man who had learned to weigh every word. The work had been harder than Barbara had expected, but not impossibly so. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a loft area that Nathan used for storage and a root cellar that required constant attention to keep the stored vegetables from freezing or spoiling. The cooking was challenging, as Nathan's appetite was substantial and he seemed to prefer simple, hearty fare prepared with care and attention to detail. Barbara had found herself rising earlier and working later than she had anticipated, but the rhythm of the work was soothing in its own way. What puzzled her most about Nathan Allen was the contradiction between his reputation and his behavior. The man who was supposed to be hard on women, especially pregnant ones, had shown her nothing but distant courtesy. He had never raised his voice to her, never criticized her work beyond a few terse suggestions for improvement, and had even gone out of his way to ensure she had everything she needed to do her job effectively. On her third day at the homestead, Barbara had been struggling to move a heavy pot from the stove when Nathan had appeared beside her, without warning, lifting the burden from her hands with ease. "Be careful," he had said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You shouldn't be lifting heavy things in your condition." He had set the pot where she needed it and disappeared back outside before she could thank him, leaving Barbara to wonder about the man behind the carefully maintained walls. It was on her fifth day that Barbara had begun to understand the source of Nathan's reputation. She had been hanging laundry behind the cabin when she heard voices approaching from the direction of the ridge path. Two men on horseback had emerged from the trees, their clothes and bearing marking them as townspeople, rather than the usual trappers or prospectors who occasionally passed through. Nathan had emerged from the barn to meet them, and Barbara had been close enough to hear their conversation. "We heard you had another one," the first man had said, his tone carrying a mixture of curiosity and something less pleasant. "Word is she's been here almost a week. That's got to be some kind of record for you, Nathan." The second man had laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Maybe this one's different," he had suggested. "Maybe she's desperate enough to put up with your moods." Nathan's response had been quiet, but Barbara had heard the edge in his voice that she was beginning to recognize as dangerous. "She's doing her job," he had said. "That's all that concerns anyone." The first man had dismounted, ignoring the warning in Nathan's tone. "Come now, Nathan," he had said, his voice taking on a wheedling quality. "We're just curious about the woman. Word in town is she's carrying a bastard, and everyone knows how you feel about that particular situation." The silence that followed had been charged with tension so thick Barbara could feel it from where she stood frozen beside the clothesline. When Nathan finally spoke, his voice had been deadly quiet. "Get off my land," he had said. "Now. And don't come back." The two men had exchanged glances, and Barbara had seen something pass between them that made her stomach clench with unease. "We're just looking out for the woman's welfare," the second man had said, but he was already remounting his horse. "A pregnant woman alone with you might not be safe, given your history." Nathan had taken a step forward, and Barbara had seen his hands clench into fists at his sides. "My history is none of your concern," he had replied, "and neither is the woman. Now get out." The men had left, but not before the first one had called back over his shoulder. "We'll be keeping an eye on things, Nathan, just to make sure nothing happens to this one like it did to the last one." Nathan had stood motionless until the sound of their horses had faded completely, then turned and walked back into the barn without acknowledging Barbara's presence. That evening, Nathan had been even more withdrawn than usual, eating his supper in silence and retiring to his room immediately afterward. Barbara had lain awake for hours, listening to him pace the floor above her and wondering what the men had meant about his history and what had happened to the last woman. She had thought about the careful way Nathan avoided touching her, even accidentally, and the way his eyes sometimes held a pain so deep it made her chest ache in sympathy. The next morning, Barbara had made a decision that would change everything. Instead of preparing Nathan's usual breakfast of eggs and bacon, she had spent an extra hour making fresh bread and a hearty stew that filled the cabin with rich, comforting aromas. When Nathan had emerged from his room, she had seen him stop short at the sight of the feast spread on the table. "What's all this?" he had asked, his voice carefully neutral. Barbara had met his gaze steadily. "You work hard," she had replied. "You deserve a good meal." Nathan had stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his pale eyes. Then he had seated himself at the table and eaten every bite, though he hadn't spoken a word throughout the meal. That afternoon, while Nathan was working in the barn, Barbara had taken it upon herself to explore the cabin more thoroughly. In the loft, she had discovered boxes of women's clothing in various sizes, all carefully packed away, but showing signs of hasty abandonment. Dresses left half-mended, personal items forgotten in the rush to leave, even a few letters addressed to women whose names she didn't recognize. The discovery had painted a picture of the women who had come before her, each one arriving with hope and leaving in fear. But it was the small room adjacent to Nathan's that had stopped Barbara's breath in her throat. The door had been locked, but the key hung on a nail beside the frame, and curiosity had overcome her better judgment. Inside, she had found a nursery, complete with a hand-carved cradle, shelves of carefully folded baby clothes, and a rocking chair positioned beside the single window. Everything was covered with a fine layer of dust, suggesting the room hadn't been disturbed in some time, but the care and love that had gone into its preparation was unmistakable. Barbara had stood in the doorway for a long time, her hand resting on her swollen belly as she tried to piece together the story the room told. Someone had prepared this space with infinite care and attention to detail. Someone had carved that cradle by hand, sewn those tiny clothes, chosen that particular spot for the rocking chair to catch the morning light. And someone had locked the door and walked away, leaving it all to gather dust and memories. When Nathan had returned to the cabin that evening, he had found Barbara in the kitchen, but something in her manner must have alerted him to her discovery. His eyes had gone immediately to the key in her hand, and his face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. "You went into the nursery," he had said, and it wasn't a question. Barbara had nodded, setting the key carefully on the table between them. "I'm sorry," she had said. "I was curious, and I shouldn't have intruded." Nathan had stared at the key as if it were a snake coiled to strike. "That room is private," he had said, his voice tight with control. "I'd appreciate it if you stayed out of it." "Of course," Barbara had replied, but she hadn't been able to keep herself from asking the question that had been burning in her mind since her discovery. "Was it for your child?" Nathan's head had snapped up, his pale eyes blazing with sudden fury. "That's none of your business," he had snarled. "None of it is your business. Just do your job and leave the past alone." Barbara had stepped back from the force of his anger, but she hadn't looked away. "I understand grief," she had said quietly. "I lost my husband 6 months ago, and this baby isn't his. I know what it's like to love someone you can't have and to be judged for circumstances beyond your control." Nathan had stared at her for a long moment, the anger in his eyes slowly giving way to something that might have been recognition. "The woman who was supposed to use that room," he had said finally, his voice so quiet Barbara had to strain to hear him. "She left when she found out about my reputation. Said she couldn't risk her child being raised by a man like me." Barbara had felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. "What kind of man are they saying you are?" she had asked. Nathan had laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor. "The kind who drives women away," he had replied. "The kind who can't be trusted with innocent lives. The kind whose own child would be better off without him." Barbara had studied his face, seeing the self-loathing that twisted his features and understanding finally what drove him to isolate himself on this remote ridge. "That's not the man I've seen," she had said firmly. "The man I've seen is careful and considerate. He makes sure I have everything I need, and he's never once made me feel unsafe or unwelcome. That's not the behavior of a man who can't be trusted." Nathan had shaken his head, but Barbara had pressed on. "Whatever happened before, whatever they're saying about you in town, it doesn't change what I've experienced here. You don't know the whole story, Nathan had warned, but some of the tension had gone out of his shoulders. Barbara had moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in his eyes and the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. Then tell me, she had said. Help me understand why 7 women ran away and why you think you are not worthy of the life you've built here. Nathan had been quiet for so long that Barbara had begun to think he wouldn't answer. Then slowly, as if the words were being dragged from some deep place inside him, he had begun to speak. The woman who was going to have my child, he had said, her name was Sarah. She was young and beautiful and everything I thought I wanted. But when the town found out she was carrying a bastard, they made her life hell, called her names, treated her like a pariah, made it clear she wasn't welcome anywhere. Barbara had waited, sensing there was more to the story. Sarah couldn't take the pressure, Nathan had continued. She tried to get rid of the baby, and it went wrong. She died and the child with her, and it was my fault for putting her in that position. The whole town blamed me, said I had seduced an innocent girl and then abandoned her to face the consequences alone. But that's not what happened, Barbara had said, reading the truth in his eyes. Nathan had shaken his head. No, he had agreed. I wanted to marry her, but she refused. Said she couldn't tie herself to a man with no prospects, no future. But when she died, the truth didn't matter. I was the villain in their story, and nothing I could say would change that. So you came here, Barbara had said, understanding flooding through her. You built this place as far from town as you could get, and you've been punishing yourself ever since. Nathan had nodded, his pale eyes fixed on the floor. Every woman who comes here leaves because they hear the stories, he had said. They see the nursery and they think about what happened to Sarah, and they realize they can't risk their own children by staying. Barbara had reached out then, her hand covering his where it rested on the table. Her touch had made him flinch, but he hadn't pulled away. I'm not leaving, she had said firmly. I don't care what they say in town, and I don't care about the past. What I care about is that you've given me a home when I had nowhere else to go, and you've treated me with more respect than anyone has since my husband died. Nathan had stared at her hand covering his expression unreadable. You should leave, he had said, but there was no conviction in his voice. You should take your child and find somewhere safe, away from me and my reputation. Barbara had squeezed his hand gently. This is safe, she had replied. You've made it safe, and I'm staying. That night, for the first time since Barbara's arrival, Nathan had not retreated to his room immediately after supper. Instead, he had remained at the table while she cleaned the dishes, occasionally commenting on her work or asking about her day. It was a small thing, but it felt like a breakthrough, as if some invisible barrier between them had finally begun to crumble. Over the following days, Nathan had gradually become less withdrawn. He had begun to linger over meals, sharing stories of his work or asking Barbara about her life before coming to the homestead. She had learned that he was an educated man, that the books lining the cabin walls were not just for show, but were well-read and carefully maintained. He had a quick mind and a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt safe enough to let his guard down. Barbara had also begun to see glimpses of the man Nathan had been before grief and guilt had driven him into isolation. He was gentle with the animals, patient with the endless, small tasks that kept the homestead running, and surprisingly thoughtful in his consideration for her comfort and well-being. When she had mentioned that her back ached from sleeping on the narrow bed, he had appeared the next day with additional padding and pillows. When she had struggled with the heavy water buckets, he had rigged a pulley system that made the task manageable. It was during her 3rd week at the homestead that Barbara had realized she was falling in love with Nathan Allen. The recognition had come suddenly while she was watching him repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a fallen tree. He had worked with quiet concentration, his movements economical and sure, and something about the sight of him had made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. The realization had terrified her. She had come to the homestead seeking only shelter and employment, not emotional entanglement with a man whose reputation had driven away 7 other women. But as she watched Nathan work, seeing the care he took with every task and the gentle way he handled the animals, Barbara had known that her feelings were beyond her control. That evening, as they sat together after supper, Barbara had found herself studying Nathan's profile as he read by lamplight. The harsh lines of his face had softened in the warm glow, and she could see traces of the younger man he had once been, before loss and guilt had carved their marks into his features. When he had looked up and caught her watching him, Something had passed between them that neither had acknowledged aloud, but both had felt. The first snow had come early that year, arriving in late October with a ferocity that caught everyone by surprise. Barbara had awakened to find the world transformed, the familiar landscape buried beneath a blanket of white that stretched as far as the eye could see. Nathan had emerged from his room already dressed for the weather, his expression grim as he surveyed the scene through the cabin windows. "This is going to be a hard winter," he had said, pulling on his heavy coat. "The snow's too early and too deep. We'll need to bring in extra firewood and check the animals more frequently." Barbara had nodded, though privately she had wondered if the early snow might trap her at the homestead longer than she had originally planned. The thought should have worried her, but instead, she had felt a secret thrill at the prospect of spending the long winter months alone with Nathan. The snow had continued for 3 days, piling up against the cabin walls and making travel impossible. Nathan had worked tirelessly to keep the paths clear and the animals fed, returning to the cabin each evening exhausted and covered with snow. Barbara had made sure hot meals were waiting for him, and gradually the forced intimacy of being snowed in together had broken down the last of the barriers between them. On the fourth night, as they sat before the fire listening to the wind howl outside, Nathan had finally told Barbara the complete truth about Sarah and the child they had lost. The story had been more complicated than the version he had shared before, filled with nuances of class and social pressure that had made their relationship impossible from the start. Sarah had been the daughter of the town's most prominent family, and her pregnancy had threatened to destroy not only her own reputation, but that of her entire family. "I should have insisted we leave town together," Nathan had said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have taken her away from all the judgment and gossip, found somewhere we could start fresh. But I was young and proud, and I thought I could weather the storm, thought I could prove to everyone that I was worthy of her." Barbara had listened without judgment, understanding finally the depth of guilt that had driven Nathan to exile himself from human society. When Nathan had finished his story, Barbara had shared her own, telling him about her marriage to a man she had respected but never loved, about the loneliness that had driven her to seek comfort in the arms of another, and about the guilt she carried for betraying her husband's memory even as she grieved his loss. They had sat together in the firelight, two wounded souls finding solace in shared honesty, and Barbara had known that whatever happened between them, she would never regret this moment of perfect understanding. The next morning had brought clear skies and the beginning of the long process of digging out from the storm. Nathan had worked with renewed energy, and Barbara had noticed a lightness in his manner that had been absent since her arrival. They had fallen into an easy rhythm of shared labor, Nathan handling the heavy outdoor work while Barbara managed the household tasks that kept them warm and fed. It was during this period that Barbara had begun to see the man Nathan could be when he wasn't carrying the weight of the past on his shoulders. He had a quick laugh and an easy smile, and his conversation ranged over topics from literature to philosophy to the practical matters of homestead management. He was well-read and thoughtful, with opinions on everything from politics to poetry, and Barbara had found herself looking forward to their evening conversations with an anticipation that had nothing to do with mere companionship. As November had progressed and Barbara's pregnancy had advanced, Nathan had become increasingly protective of her, taking over more of the household tasks and insisting she rest whenever possible. He had moved her into the larger bedroom, claiming the smaller room for himself, and had spent hours crafting a more comfortable chair for her to use while sewing or reading. His consideration had been touching in its thoroughness, and Barbara had begun to see glimpses of the father he might have been under different circumstances. It was on a cold evening in late November that the fragile peace they had built together had been shattered. Barbara had been preparing supper when she had heard horses approaching, their hoofbeats muffled by the snow, but unmistakably heading toward the cabin. Nathan had emerged from the barn, his face grim as he recognized the riders, and Barbara had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather as she saw who had come calling. The same two men who had visited weeks earlier had returned, but this time they had brought companions, 5 men in total whose presence seemed to fill the clearing with menace. Nathan had positioned himself between the riders and the cabin, his stance radiating tension, and Barbara had retreated to the window to watch the confrontation unfold. "We told you we'd be keeping an eye on things," the leader had called out, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "Word in town is the woman's still here, and that's got people talking." Some folks think it's time someone checked on her welfare, made sure she's not being held against her will. Nathan's response had been measured but firm. The lady is here by choice, he had said. She's free to leave anytime she wants, and she knows it. But the men had dismounted anyway, their movements deliberate and threatening. We'd like to hear that from her, the second man had said, face to face without you standing there intimidating her. Barbara had known in that moment that she had to act, that Nathan's careful isolation would not protect them from the mob mentality that had driven these men to his door. She had stepped outside, her pregnancy evident beneath her heavy coat, and had faced the five men with a courage that had surprised even herself. Gentlemen, she had said, her voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered clearing, I appreciate your concern, but it's misplaced. Mr. Allen has treated me with nothing but courtesy and respect since my arrival. The leader had studied her with eyes that held no warmth. You're sure about that, Mrs., he had asked? You're not being coerced or threatened in any way. Barbara had lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of dignity she hadn't known she possessed. I'm quite sure, she had replied. In fact, I've never felt safer or more welcome anywhere in my life. The men had exchanged glances, clearly not satisfied with her response, but uncertain how to proceed. Nathan had moved closer to Barbara, his presence solid and reassuring at her side. You've heard from the lady, he had said. Now I'll ask you to leave my property and not return. The leader had remounted his horse, but his expression had promised that this was not the end of the matter. We'll be watching, he had said, and if anything happens to this woman or her child, we'll know where to look. After the men had left, Nathan had been quieter than usual, his pale eyes troubled as he contemplated the implications of their visit. They won't give up, he had told Barbara as they sat before the fire that evening. They're looking for any excuse to blame me if something goes wrong, and your presence here gives them the perfect opportunity. Barbara had reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with a boldness that surprised them both. Then we'll have to make sure nothing goes wrong, she had said simply. December had arrived with a series of blizzards that had effectively cut them off from the outside world. The snow had piled so high that even the barn had been difficult to reach, and Nathan had been forced to string ropes between the buildings to avoid getting lost in the whiteout conditions. Barbara had worried about his safety every time he had ventured outside, and she had begun to understand how completely dependent they were on each other for survival. It was during one of these blizzards that Barbara had gone into labor 3 weeks earlier than expected and with no possibility of reaching town for medical help. Nathan had delivered the baby himself, his hand steady and sure despite his obvious terror, talking her through each contraction with a calmness that had belied the panic in his eyes. When their daughter had finally arrived, small but healthy, Nathan had wept openly as he placed the tiny bundle in Barbara's arms. She's beautiful, he had whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She's perfect. Barbara had looked down at the red-faced infant in her arms and had known with absolute certainty that this child belonged to both of them, regardless of biology. When she had looked up to find Nathan watching them with an expression of wonder and longing, she had made a decision that would change all their lives. Her name is Sarah, Barbara had said quietly. Sarah Allen. Nathan's breath had caught at the name, and Barbara had seen tears spill over his cheeks as he understood what she was offering him. A chance at redemption, a family to replace the one he had lost, a future built on love rather than guilt and regret. Nathan had reached out with trembling fingers to touch the baby's tiny hand, his voice breaking as he spoke. Are you sure, he had asked. Are you sure you want her to carry my name? Barbara had smiled through her own tears. I'm sure about everything, she had replied. I'm sure about her, and I'm sure about you, and I'm sure about us. The weeks following Sarah's birth had been the happiest of Barbara's life. Nathan had thrown himself into the role of father with a devotion that had been beautiful to witness, staying up nights when the baby was fussy, crafting toys and furniture for her use, and talking to her in the soft, gentle voice that Barbara had come to love. The nursery that had gathered dust for so long had been cleaned and prepared, and Barbara had felt a deep satisfaction in seeing it used for its intended purpose. But their happiness had been shadowed by the knowledge that the men from town would return eventually, and when they did, they would find a situation that would confirm their worst suspicions about Nathan Allen. A pregnant woman had come to his homestead, and now there was a baby, And the timing would seem to support every ugly rumor that had ever been whispered about him. It was Nathan who had proposed the solution that would protect them all. "We should get married," he had said one evening as they sat together watching baby Sarah sleep in her cradle. "It would give you and the baby legal protection, and it would silence the gossips once and for all." Barbara had looked at him carefully, searching his face for any sign that he was proposing out of duty rather than love. "Is that what you want?" she had asked. "A marriage of convenience to protect us from scandal?" Nathan had set down his book and turned to face her fully. "No," he had said, his pale eyes intense with emotion. "What I want is to spend the rest of my life taking care of you and Sarah, loving you both and proving every day that I'm worthy of the trust you've placed in me. What I want is a real marriage, Barbara, if you'll have me." Barbara had felt her heart swell with joy as she realized that Nathan was offering her everything she had never dared to hope for. A home, a family, a man who loved her not despite her flaws and her paeda, but because of the strength and courage she had shown in overcoming them. "Yes," she had whispered, reaching for his hands. "Yes, I'll marry you." They had been married 3 days later in a simple ceremony performed by Nathan himself, using a book of common prayer he had found among his father's belongings. There had been no guests, no flowers, no elaborate ceremony, but Barbara had never felt more beautiful or more cherished than she did standing in the main room of the cabin, promising to love and honor the man who had given her everything she had ever wanted. The winter had continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, warmth and love had created a sanctuary that felt impervious to the cold. Nathan had proven to be everything Barbara had hoped for in a husband: attentive and affectionate, patient with the baby's demands, and endlessly considerate of Barbara's needs as she recovered from childbirth. They had fallen into the rhythm of married life with an ease that suggested they had been meant for each other all along. It was on a bright morning in late February that their peaceful existence had been shattered once again. Barbara had been nursing baby Sarah when she had heard the sound of many horses approaching, far more than the small group that had visited before. Nathan had emerged from the barn, his face grim as he counted the riders, and Barbara had felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that nearly half the men from town had come calling. The leader of the group had been Tyler Scott, the town's self-appointed moral authority, a man whose wealth and influence had given him the power to shape public opinion according to his own prejudices. He had dismounted with theatrical flourish, his voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered clearing as he addressed Nathan with obvious contempt. "Nathan Allen," he had called out, his tone formal and accusatory. "We've come to investigate reports of criminal activity on this property. Reports that you've been holding a woman against her will and may have fathered a child through force or coercion." Barbara had felt rage surge through her at the ugly implications of the accusation, and she had stood up from her chair, still holding baby Sarah, and moved to the window where the men could see her clearly. Tyler Scott had continued his speech, clearly enjoying his moment of authority. "We demand to speak with the woman privately, without your presence or influence, to determine whether she's here of her own free will or whether she's been victimized by your well-documented history of violence against women." The accusation had been so far from the truth that Barbara had felt almost dizzy with anger, but she had forced herself to remain calm as she considered how to respond. Nathan had taken a step forward, his hands clenched at his sides but his voice carefully controlled. "There's been no crime committed here," he had said. "The lady is my wife, and the child is mine by law and by choice. We were married 3 months ago and we're living here as a family." But Tyler Scott had laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Convenient timing," he had said. "A pregnant woman arrives, a baby appears, and suddenly there's a marriage. Forgive us if we find your story difficult to believe." Barbara had made her decision then, knowing that only the truth would protect them from the mob mentality that had brought these men to their door. She had wrapped baby Sarah in a warm blanket and stepped outside, her chin lifted with dignity as she faced the assembled crowd. "Gentlemen," she had said, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air, "I am Barbara Allen, and this is my daughter Sarah. I came to this homestead of my own free will, and I married Nathan Allen because I love him and because he's the finest man I've ever known." Tyler Scott had studied her with obvious skepticism. "And the child?" he had asked. "Are you claiming Nathan Allen as the father?" Barbara had met his gaze steadily. "I'm claiming that Nathan Allen is Sarah's father in every way that matters," she had replied. "He delivered her, he's cared for her since birth, and he loves her as his own. That makes him her father, regardless of biology." The crowd had murmured among themselves, clearly not satisfied with her response, but uncertain how to proceed. Nathan had moved to Barbara's side, his arms sliding around her waist in a gesture of protection and unity. "My wife has told you the truth," he had said. "We're a family, living peacefully on our own land, bothering no one. I'll ask you to respect that and leave us be." But Tyler Scott had not been deterred. "We have reports," he had said, his voice taking on a sinister tone, "that the woman was seen in town last fall, clearly pregnant and claiming to be a widow. Are you telling us that child was fathered by her dead husband?" The question had been designed to trap Barbara in a lie, but she had answered it with the same honesty that had characterized all her dealings with Nathan. "No," she had said simply. "My daughter was not fathered by my late husband. She was conceived out of wedlock, and I came here seeking work to support myself and my child. Nathan offered me employment, then friendship, then love, and finally marriage. He's given us a home and a name, and he's asked for nothing in return except the chance to be the husband and father he was meant to be." The admission had caused a stir among the crowd, but Barbara had continued before anyone could interrupt. "I know what you're thinking," she had said. "You're thinking that proves Nathan Allen is the kind of man who takes advantage of desperate women. But you're wrong. He could have demanded anything from me, and I would have agreed because I had nowhere else to go. Instead, he treated me with respect and kindness, and he waited for me to offer my heart freely before he accepted it." Tyler Scott had exchanged glances with his companions, clearly frustrated by Barbara's refusal to play the victim they had expected to find. "And you're happy here?" he had asked, his tone suggesting he found the idea impossible to believe. "You're not being held against your will or threatened in any way." Barbara had smiled, looking up at Nathan with love shining clearly in her eyes. "I've never been happier anywhere in my life," she had said. "Nathan has given me everything I never knew I wanted, and I wouldn't trade our life here for anything the world could offer." The crowd had begun to disperse then, their mission clearly a failure. But Tyler Scott had made one last attempt to salvage his authority. "We'll be watching," he had said, his voice carrying a threat that made Barbara's skin crawl. "And if we hear any reports of trouble, any sign that you're not being treated properly, we'll be back." Barbara had lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with steady courage. "You do that," she had replied. "Watch all you want. You'll see a woman who's loved and cherished, living with a man who would die before he'd let any harm come to her or her child." After the men had left, Nathan had been quiet for a long time, holding Barbara and baby Sarah close, as if he feared they might disappear if he let them go. "They'll never stop," he had said finally. "There will always be someone ready to believe the worst about me, someone looking for proof that I'm the monster they want me to be." Barbara had stroked his hair, feeling the tension in his shoulders and the rapid beating of his heart against her cheek. "Then we'll prove them wrong," she had said firmly. "Every day, for the rest of our lives, we'll prove them wrong by being happy, by being a family, by showing everyone that love is stronger than gossip and truth is more powerful than lies." Nathan had pulled back to look at her, his pale eyes bright with unshed tears. "How did I get so lucky?" he had asked. "How did I deserve someone like you?" Barbara had smiled, remembering the frightened, desperate woman she had been when she first climbed the ridge path to his homestead. "You didn't get lucky," she had said. "You earned it. You earned it by being kind when you could have been cruel, by being patient when you could have been demanding, and by loving us when you could have protected yourself by staying alone." Nathan had kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and gratitude, and Barbara had known that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The spring had come late that year, but when it finally arrived, it had brought with it a sense of renewal and hope that had infected every aspect of their lives. Nathan had thrown himself into the work of expanding the homestead, adding rooms to the cabin and improving the barn and outbuildings. Barbara had planted a larger garden and had begun raising chickens, creating the kind of self-sufficient household she had always dreamed of. Baby Sarah had thrived in the mountain air, growing strong and healthy under the devoted care of both her parents. Nathan had proven to be a natural father, patient with her fussiness, delighted by her smiles, and endlessly creative in finding ways to entertain and educate her. Barbara had watched him with their daughter and had known that whatever mistakes he might have made in the past, he was exactly the father Sarah needed. As summer had progressed, other changes had become apparent. The hostility from town had gradually diminished and as people had grown accustomed to the idea of Nathan Allen as a married man and father. Visitors had become rare, and when they did come, they had been more likely to be seeking Nathan's help with some practical matter than looking for scandal to report. The homestead's reputation for self-sufficiency and prosperity had begun to overshadow the old gossip about Nathan's past. Barbara had also begun to see changes in Nathan himself. The wariness that had characterized his interactions with others had gradually given way to a quiet confidence, and the pain that had shadowed his eyes for so long had been replaced by contentment. He had begun to speak of the future with enthusiasm rather than dread, making plans for Sarah's education and dreaming aloud about the life they would build together. It was on a warm evening in late August that Nathan had made the announcement that would cement their place in the community and put an end to the whispers that had followed him for so long. He had been offered the position of school teacher for the mountain communities, a job that would require them to open their home to children from the surrounding area, but would also provide a steady income and social respectability. Barbara had been thrilled by the opportunity, knowing that Nathan's education and natural patience would make him an excellent teacher. More importantly, she had recognized the symbolic significance of the offer. The community was ready to trust Nathan Allen with their children, the most precious thing they possessed, and that trust would go a long way toward erasing the stain of his past. The school had opened in September with 8 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, making the daily journey to the Allen homestead for their lessons. Nathan had proven to be everything Barbara had expected and more, patient with the slow learners, challenging for the quick ones, and endlessly creative in finding the ways to make learning engaging and fun. The children had adored him, and their parents had quickly recognized that their sons and daughters were receiving an education that surpassed anything available in the larger towns. As autumn had turned to winter once again, Barbara had reflected on the changes that had transformed their lives over the past year. The homestead that had once been a place of exile and isolation had become the heart of a thriving community. The man who had been shunned and whispered about was now respected and valued. The woman who had arrived desperate and alone was now cherished and secure. But it was on a cold December morning, exactly 1 year after baby Sarah's birth, that the final test of their happiness had come. Barbara had been preparing breakfast when she had heard a single horse approaching, and she had looked out to see a woman dismounting in their yard. The visitor had been young and well-dressed, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was steeling herself for an unpleasant task. Nathan had emerged from the barn to greet the visitor, and Barbara had seen his face go pale as he recognized her. The woman had been Sarah's sister, come to tell Nathan that their father was dying and wanted to see him before the end. She had also brought news that Sarah's death had been investigated more thoroughly in recent years, and Nathan had been officially cleared of any wrongdoing in the matter. The vindication had been bittersweet, coming too late to undo years of exile and pain, but offering finally the closure Nathan needed to put the past behind him completely. He had chosen not to make the journey to see Sarah's father, explaining to Barbara that his family was here now with her and baby Sarah, and he had no desire to revisit a past that had caused him so much anguish. The visitor had stayed for dinner, and Barbara had watched with interest as Nathan's former sister-in-law had observed their family life. She had seen the love between Nathan and Barbara, the devotion he showed to baby Sarah, and the contentment that radiated from every aspect of their home. When she had prepared to leave, she had taken Nathan aside and spoken to him privately for several minutes. Later that evening, Nathan had shared the conversation with Barbara. "She told me she was wrong about me," he had said, his voice filled with wonder. "She said she could see that I was meant to be a husband and father, and she was sorry for the part her family played in driving me away." Barbara had felt a deep satisfaction at the apology, knowing how much Nathan had needed to hear those words. But more importantly, the visit had marked the final laying to rest of the ghosts that had haunted Nathan for so long. He had been able to speak of Sarah without pain, to remember their brief time together with fondness rather than guilt, and to acknowledge that her death, while tragic, had not been his fault. The man who had carried the weight of undeserved blame for so many years had finally been able to set that burden down. Winter had settled over the homestead once again, But this time it had brought with it a sense of peace and completion rather than isolation and hardship. The school had continued to operate, with children arriving each morning despite the snow and cold, eager for the lessons Nathan provided and the warmth of the Allen home. Barbara had found joy in feeding the hungry students and watching Nathan work with them, seeing in his patience and dedication the teacher he had always been meant to be. As Christmas had approached, Barbara had made preparations for the first real celebration their family had ever shared. She had invited some of the children's families to join them for a holiday feast, and to her delight, several had accepted. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness would ring with laughter and conversation, filled with friends who valued Nathan for the man he had become, rather than judging him for the past he had overcome. On Christmas Eve, as Barbara had sat before the fire nursing baby Sarah, while Nathan read aloud from a book of poetry, she had reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had come to the homestead as the fat widow, desperate and alone, seeking nothing more than shelter and employment. She had found instead a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible, and a family that completed her in ways she hadn't known she was incomplete. Nathan had looked up from his reading to find her watching him, and the smile that had spread across his face had been radiant with happiness. "What are you thinking about?" he had asked, setting the book aside and moving to sit beside her on the sofa. Barbara had leaned into his warmth, feeling baby Sarah settle contentedly between them. "I'm thinking about how wrong they all were," she had said softly. "The people who said no pregnant woman could last 3 days here. The ones who whispered that you were dangerous and untrustworthy. They never understood that you weren't driving women away because you were cruel. You were protecting yourself from more pain, and you were waiting for someone who could see past the rumors to the man underneath." Nathan had wrapped his arms around both of them, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke. "I stopped believing I deserved happiness a long time ago," he had said. "I thought I was meant to live alone, to pay for my mistakes by never having the family I wanted. But you changed everything, Barbara. You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, and you gave me the courage to believe I could be better than my past." Baby Sarah had stirred in Barbara's arms, making the soft sounds that meant she was waking up, and Nathan had reached out to stroke her tiny hand with infinite gentleness. "And now we have her," he had said wonderingly. "Our beautiful daughter, who will never know a day without love, never doubt that she's wanted and cherished. We've given her everything I never had, everything Sarah and I never got to give our child." Barbara had felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of Nathan's lost love, but they had been tears of gratitude rather than sadness. Sarah's memory was no longer a source of pain, but a reminder of Nathan's capacity for love and his determination to honor that love by being the best husband and father he could be. The past had been transformed from a burden into a foundation, something that strengthened rather than weakened their present happiness. As the fire had burned low and baby Sarah had drifted back to sleep, Barbara had made a silent promise to the woman who had loved Nathan first. She would make sure he never doubted his worth again, never questioned whether he deserved the love and respect he had earned through his actions. She would help him build the life Sarah had wanted for him, the life he had always been meant to have. The next morning had dawned bright and clear, with snow sparkling like diamonds in the early sunlight. Nathan had risen early to tend to the animals and prepare for their guests, and Barbara had watched him through the kitchen window as he worked, marveling at the transformation that love and acceptance had wrought in him. The man who had once moved through his days with the careful precision of someone afraid to make a mistake, now worked with the easy confidence of someone who knew his place in the world. Their guests had begun arriving at midday, families bundled against the cold but radiating warmth and good cheer as they gathered in the Allen home. Barbara had prepared a feast that showcased all her skills as a cook, and she had felt a deep pride as she watched Nathan interact with their neighbors, seeing the respect and affection in their eyes when they looked at him. The man who had once been shunned was now the center of a community that valued his contributions and cherished his friendship. As the afternoon had worn on and the stories and laughter had flowed freely, Barbara had found herself thinking about the other women who had come to the homestead before her. She had wondered what their lives had been like after they left, whether they had found the safety and happiness they had been seeking, whether they ever thought about the man they had left behind. She hoped they had found peace, but she was grateful that their inability to see Nathan's worth had left him free to become hers. The celebration had continued into the evening, with Nathan playing his guitar and leading the group in songs that ranged from traditional carols to folk ballads that told stories of love and loss and redemption. His voice had been rich and warm, and Barbara had seen tears in more than one pair of eyes as he sang, his music touching something deep in the hearts of all who heard it. When their guests had finally departed, leaving behind a cabin filled with the lingering warmth of friendship and fellowship, Barbara and Nathan had sat together in the quiet aftermath, baby Sarah sleeping peacefully in her cradle beside them. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the only sounds had been the whisper of wind through the trees and the soft breathing of their sleeping daughter. This is what happiness feels like, Barbara had thought to herself, storing the moment in her memory like a treasure to be examined and cherished in years to come. This sense of completeness, of being exactly where she belonged with exactly the people she was meant to love. She had traveled a long and difficult road to reach this place, but every step had been worth it for the joy of this moment. Nathan had reached for her hand in the darkness, his fingers intertwining with hers with the easy familiarity of long practice. "Thank you," he had whispered, his voice so soft she had almost missed the words. "Thank you for staying when everyone else ran away, for seeing who I really was when I couldn't see it myself, for giving me the family I thought I'd lost forever." Barbara had squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and the gentle strength that had protected and provided for them both. "You don't need to thank me," she had replied. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I've ever done. You made it easy by being worthy of love, by earning it every day through your actions and your character." They had sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, but connected by the invisible threads of love and shared experience that bound them together. Baby Sarah had stirred in her sleep, making the soft sounds that never failed to melt Nathan's heart, and he had risen to check on her, his movements careful and quiet in the dim light. "She's perfect," he had whispered, his voice filled with the wonder that still overcame him whenever he looked at their daughter. "Sometimes I can't believe she's really ours, that we get to watch her grow up and become whoever she's meant to be." Barbara had joined him beside the cradle, slipping her arm around his waist as they stood together, watching their sleeping child. "She's ours," Barbara had said firmly. "Ours by choice and by love, and that's the strongest bond there is. She'll grow up knowing she's wanted and cherished, knowing that her father is a man of honor and integrity who would move mountains to protect her. That's the greatest gift we can give her." Nathan had turned to look at Barbara then, his pale eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you," he had said, the words carrying the weight of everything he felt but could never fully express. "I love you for staying, for believing in me, for giving me Sarah, for making me believe I could be the man you see when you look at me." Barbara had reached up to cup his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his beard and the warmth of his skin beneath her palms. "And I love you for being exactly who you are," she had replied. "For being strong enough to survive the worst that life could throw at you. For being gentle enough to care for a woman and child who weren't your responsibility. For being brave enough to love again after losing everything." They had kissed then, a kiss that spoke of promise and commitment, of love that had been tested and proven true. Baby Sarah had chosen that moment to wake up, her soft cry breaking the spell, but not diminishing the magic of the moment. Nathan had lifted her from the cradle with practiced ease, cradling her against his chest as he murmured soft words of comfort. As Barbara had watched her husband soothe their daughter, she had felt a profound sense of gratitude for the chain of events that had brought them together. Her husband's death, tragic as it had freed her to find a love she never could have imagined. Her pregnancy, scandalous as it was, had given Nathan the chance to be the father he was meant to be. Even the gossip and hostility they had faced had served a purpose, forcing them to depend on each other, improving the strength of their bond. The fat widow who had climbed the ridge path over a year ago had been transformed into a woman who knew her own worth, who had found her place in the world and the love that made everything else possible. The bitter, isolated man who had driven away 7 women had become a husband and father whose capacity for love seemed to grow deeper every day. Together they had created something beautiful from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. As winter had deepened around them, their love had only grown stronger. The challenges that had once seemed insurmountable had become opportunities to prove their commitment to each other and to the life they were building together. The homestead that had been a place of exile had become a sanctuary, a place where love flourished and dreams came true. Nathan had continued to excel as a teacher, his reputation spreading throughout the mountain communities as word of his skill and dedication had traveled from family to family. Children from farther and farther away had begun making the journey to the Allen homestead for their education, and Nathan had started making plans to expand the school to accommodate the growing enrollment. Barbara had found her own calling in supporting Nathan's work and creating a home that welcomed everyone who entered it. Her cooking had become legendary among the families whose children attended the school, and she had taken pride in knowing that no child ever left their table hungry. The woman who had once felt useless and unwanted had discovered that she had gifts that were valued and appreciated. But perhaps most importantly, they had created a family that was built on love rather than obligation, choice rather than chance. Baby Sarah had grown into a bright, happy child who was adored by everyone who met her, and Nathan had proven that biology was less important than devotion when it came to being a father. The love between them all was evident to anyone who spent time in their home, and it had gradually silenced even the most persistent critics. As spring had returned once again, bringing with it the promise of new life and fresh beginnings, Barbara had discovered that she was pregnant again. The news had filled Nathan with joy so profound that he had wept openly, holding her close as he whispered his gratitude for the gift of another child. This time, there would be no scandal, no whispers, no doubt about the legitimacy of their happiness. The second pregnancy had been easier than the first, perhaps because Barbara was no longer carrying the weight of uncertainty and fear that had burdened her before. She was surrounded by love and support, secure in the knowledge that her child would be born into a family that wanted and cherished every new addition. Nathan had been even more protective and attentive than before, if such a thing were possible, and baby Sarah had seemed to understand that she would soon have a sibling to love and protect. Their son had been born on a beautiful morning in early autumn, arriving easily and quickly as if he were eager to join the family that awaited him. Nathan had delivered this child as well, his hands steady and sure with experience, and when he had placed the baby in Barbara's arms, she had seen the completion of everything they had dreamed of together. "We'll call him Samuel," Nathan had said, his voice thick with emotion, "after my father, who would have loved him dearly." Barbara had nodded, thinking of the grandfather their children would never know, but whose legacy lived on in the man Nathan had become. Samuel Allen would grow up knowing he was loved and wanted, secure in the knowledge that his father was a man of honor and integrity. As Barbara had nursed her newborn son, while Nathan played with baby Sarah beside the bed, she had reflected on the journey that had brought them to this perfect moment. The desperate woman who had answered Nathan's advertisement had found not just employment, but everything she had never dared to hope for. The broken man who had isolated himself from the world had discovered that love could heal even the deepest wounds. They had proven that the gossips and critics were wrong, that love was stronger than reputation, that character mattered more than past mistakes. The homestead that had been a place of exile had become a beacon of hope, proof that redemption was possible for anyone willing to fight for it. The man who had been labeled dangerous and untrustworthy had become a pillar of the community, respected and valued for his contributions. But most importantly, they had created a love story that would endure, a family that would carry on their legacy of choosing love over fear, acceptance over judgment, hope over despair. Their children would grow up knowing that they were the products of a love that had overcome every obstacle, a testament to the power of two people who had refused to let the past define their future. As the seasons continued to turn and their family continued to grow and thrive, Barbara never forgot the lessons she had learned during those early days on the homestead. Love required courage, trust demanded risk, and happiness was something that had to be chosen again and again, day after day, in the face of whatever challenges life might bring. The fat widow who had lasted not just 3 days but a lifetime had proven that sometimes the most unlikely people could find the most extraordinary love. Nathan Allen, the man who had driven away 7 women, had needed only one who could see past his reputation to the heart beneath. Together, they had created something beautiful from the ashes of their separate sorrows, a love that would endure long after the gossips had forgotten what they once whispered about the man on the ridge. In the end, their story was not about the women who had run away, but about the one who had stayed, not about the mistakes of the past, but about the redemption that love could bring. It was a story of second chances and new beginnings, of finding family in unexpected places and discovering that home was not a place, but a feeling, not a destination, but a journey shared with the people who mattered most. And as Barbara sat in her rocking chair on warm summer evenings, watching Nathan teach their children to fish in the creek that ran past their home, she knew that she had found everything she had ever wanted in the most unlikely place with the most unexpected man. The homestead that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with laughter, and the man who had been branded as dangerous had become the safest harbor she had ever known.